Where and how does Paul introduce this main idea? Well, he does so in verse 18 of chapter 1, which reads, "For the wrath of God is being revealed from heaven against all the godlessness and wickedness of people who suppress the truth by their wickedness." Now again, let me ramp up to this statement. Why is Paul eager to preach the gospel in Rome, as he states in verse 15? Because he is not ashamed of the gospel. And why is Paul not ashamed of the gospel? Because it reveals God's righteousness, which is for all who believe. And why does the gospel reveal God's righteousness? Because God's wrath is also revealed against godlessness and wickedness. Righteousness is revealed because righteousness is needed. God's righteousness is revealed to rescue people from God's wrath. Now let's follow Paul's train of thought to see how he develops this idea of God's wrath against unrighteousness and how God solves that problem with the revelation of his righteousness. Again, revelation of wrath against unrighteousness. How does Paul prove that? And how does that then lead into the revelation of righteousness, which saves from wrath? Well, first, Paul aims to draw his Jewish readers into agreement with his indictment of humanity by painting a dark picture of humanity's idolatry and resulting sinfulness. And this is what Paul does in the rest of chapter 1, verses 18 through 32. First, Paul draws attention to Gentile idolatry. And idolatry was considered by some Jews to be the root sin that leads Gentiles into subsequent vices. You see this in Jewish writings, and Paul somewhat echoes the argument here in chapter 1. Notice especially verses 21 through 23. "For though they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him. But they became futile in their thinking, and their senseless hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools, and they exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling a mortal human, or birds, or four-footed animals, or reptiles." So here the train of thought there. Since the Gentiles didn't know God, or at least didn't acknowledge God, however we read that phrase, although they knew God, whether that's they knew about him or they left the knowledge of God, however we read that, they didn't act on that. They didn't acknowledge God in their living. And because of that disconnect, they therefore created God in their own image. I forget who said it, but God created humans in his image, and they've been repaying the favor ever since. So they didn't acknowledge God. And so they in turn created God, thought of God in their own image. They worshipped and served the creature rather than the creator, as verse 25 says. Therefore, God gave them over to subsequent vices. Verse 24, therefore God gave them over in the desires of their hearts to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves. And Paul describes that dishonoring in detail in verses 26 and 27. So notice that train of thought. From idolatry comes resulting immorality. And then lastly, from these root sins flow all manner of other sin. They were filled with every kind of injustice, Paul writes in verses 29 to 31. Evil, covetousness, malice. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, craftiness. They are gossips, slanderers, God-haters, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, rebellious toward parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. And those who practice such things, Paul says, deserve to die. Verse 32. And at this point, Paul would have every Jew in the audience saying, "You got that right." So, why do we feel like there's a twist coming? Because Paul's not done.